Thank you for joining us this afternoon for The Masks, the Mail, the Myths, How We Can Protect the Right to Vote and Voters in 2020. Our panel today is part of the Raven Respite, a 3-day series of envelope-pushing conversations we've been having today with changemakers from across the progressive spectrum on today's most pressing issues. And today's is no exception. I am Myrna Perez, a principal at the Raven Group, a national public affairs and communications firm committed to making connections, solving complex problems, and inspiring change across the corporate, nonprofit, foundation, and government sectors. I head up the Raven Group's office here in Cleveland, Ohio. The COVID-19 pandemic presents a unique challenge to voting this year. Of course, as with so much in this pandemic, the challenges we see to voting are not entirely new. Rather, they are more acute versions of long-term inequities that have led to voter suppression and barriers, with minority and underserved communities hit the hardest. The federal response so far has not helped, far from it. The president has attacked vote by mail, even while doing so himself in Florida. Senate Republicans remain opposed to resources and common sense fixes to help us vote during the pandemic. And the decisions of the Supreme Court, which led directly to long lines we've seen during primary elections in Wisconsin and Georgia and so many other places, have added to the challenge. And of course, we all know about the post office and the alarming attempts to undermine service, delay service, and how it impact voting. So the threats are real, but so are the solutions. We are not powerless. We cannot let the pandemic become a cover for massive vote suppression or an excuse for failing to exercise our right to vote. Especially at this historic inflection point in our nation's history in the fight for racial justice, it has never been more important to make sure that everybody who should be able to vote has access to the ballot box. I am so excited about the conversation we're about to have today. Our panelists today are not just experts. They're also innovators in action. We will learn more about the threat to voting, but we will also hear from them about the ways we can help each other to vote safely during this year, this election, and this pandemic. Okay, so let's get moving. Our first guest today is Kristen Clarke. As president and executive director of the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, Kristen leads one of the country's most important national civil rights organizations in the pursuit of equal justice for all. The Lawyers Committee works nationally in communities around the country, including right here in Ohio, to promote fair housing and community development, economic justice, voting rights, equal education opportunities, criminal justice, judicial diversity, and so much more. I first met you, Kristen, when you were helping lead the fight to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act. When haven't you been at the heart of the fight to strengthen our democracy, to fight for the rights of all people, including minority communities and other marginalized communities to access the right to vote? At the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, at the Department of Justice, in the New York Attorney General's office, as an advocate, a lecturer, a lawyer, you've been at the heart of this for so many years. So can you start by giving it to us straight? Looking ahead to this critical election, what are you most worried about and what can we do about it?
First of all, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. And this conversation could not be more timely. We've got about 75 days to go until the November general election, and a lot of threats that we did not anticipate being up against at the start of 2020. It's interesting because when we reflect back to the start of the year, January 1, 2020, we knew that this was going to be a tough election cycle. We know that voter suppression is alive and well and rampant at every stage. We know that there are officials sadly working to purge people from the registration rolls, that are actively shutting down polling sites in communities of color, that are putting in place burdens that make it harder for people to get registered to vote. And then comes this pandemic, which has upended life for so many people across our country, upended life in virtually every respect. We've got schools shut down. We've got people unable to go to work. And the cold, hard truth is that our elections cannot be status quo under these circumstances. We need elections to be led in a dramatically different way because of an unprecedented pandemic that has resulted in loss of life and is impacting health in every corner of our country. And so there's been a bitter and fraught battle over figuring out how we deal with the restrictions that people face when it comes to accessing the ballot box. There are 3 things that we're fighting for. 1, states have got to provide 3 lanes for voters to exercise voice. 1, we need absentee voting that is open and accessible and easy for people to participate. We've got people quarantined at home, people hospitalized, people with preconditions, and nobody should be in the position of having to choose between their life and their health and their ability to exercise their right to vote. 2, we need lots of expanded opportunities for people to go and vote in person. Why? Because for a lot of people, voting in person matters. And if you can have lots of early voting opportunities, you can then ease the burdens that people will face on election day. And this primary season has been intense. We've seen the long lines in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We've seen the long lines in places like Chicago and Atlanta. We don't need to wait to see what that's going to look like in November when we're up against historic turnout numbers. So now's the time to really act and make sure that election officials are responding to the pandemic, getting rid of unnecessary rules and restrictions, easing deadlines, and doing everything in their power to make it easy for people to participate in one of the most consequential election seasons that we've ever seen. But just when you thought things couldn't get more complicated, we now have a crisis surrounding the United States Postal Service, an agency that's over 2 centuries old, backed by hardworking postal workers who do one thing and one thing only. They get us our mail on time each and every day. And their work is so critical right now. They're getting medications to people who need it in the middle of the pandemic, groceries to people who are isolated, and ballots to people who really need them. And it's been incredibly frustrating to see this administration politicize the Postal Service in the way that they have. They've got new leadership, Louis DeJoy, who's come in, and in 2 swift months, he's upended the Postal Service and put in place changes that have dramatically slowed down mail. He's ripped blue mailboxes out of communities. They've pulled scanning equipment used to process mail. They're banning overtime, putting in place hiring freezes. And we know that this is all about using the United States Postal Service as a tool to drive voter suppression across our country. So I'm hopeful, but that's kind of the lay of the land 75 days out of the election, and really looking forward to using this time together to figure out how we digest it all and to figure out what are the solutions that we need to make sure that we have a democracy that we can be proud of and a democracy in which every single voice is heard.
Good. Well, thank you, Kristen. I know you are thank you, Kristen. I know you are at the heart of this fight, and we're going to come back to you and talk about solutions, talk about what you're doing to fight. And we're certainly going to circle back to the post office. And Louis DeJoy is supposed to testify tomorrow and Monday in Congress, and the House of Representatives coming back early from a recess to take up some legislation. So we're going to talk about that. But let's bring in our next panelist, Myrna Perez, who is the director of the Brennan Center's Voting Rights and Election Program. Myrna is a national expert on voting rights and election administration. She leads the program's research, advocacy, litigation work nationwide. She does not sleep. It is true. We talked about it off camera before we came on. Some of their work has been to lay out how states and boards of elections need to prepare to have a safe and fair election during this pandemic. The Brennan Center's work has served as the basis for some of the legislation that the House has passed, and we're hoping the Senate will take up back in May. Myrna's work has been in media outlets throughout the country, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, MSNBC. She is not on your bio, Myrna. It is not noted that you had the misfortune to be my friend back in college, way too many years ago, and seeing what you've accomplished, I always feel quite in awe of you. So, Myrna, you have led the Brennan Center's work to prepare for this election, for the safe and fair election during the pandemic, and talked about, as I mentioned, what the federal response needs to be. Now, what's your top line? Based on what you've studied, are we prepared? Is it too late to be prepared? And what can we do? How can we do best given what we know to be the fact at hand?
We're not prepared. We're not even close. But we shouldn't panic. Instead, we should get to work. There's still time, and everything that we do between now and Election Day can improve the situation. There are a couple of things that we should do, which is encouraging everybody to vote early, whatever way they choose to vote. If you are a person that is going to want to vote by mail because you have health needs and such don't want to get to a polling place, great. File your mail ballot application early. Complete it early, turn it in, when you get your ballot, turn it in as quickly as possible. If your state has early in-person voting and you want to go to the polls on election day, vote early as well. This is going to be an election with a lot of glitches, even if everything from here on out goes as smooth as possible. The earlier that people vote, the more likely that they're going to be able to troubleshoot and resolve any problems that people have. I think another thing we can do is press Congress to do their job. Congress has a special role pursuant to our Constitution with federal elections. And right now, our state and local election administrators are saying that they need resources to handle all of the disruption that are coming to our election system that Kristen and others are going to point out. Our elections are going to look really different this year than they ever have before. How people are voting is going to change, where people are voting is going to change, under what circumstances people are voting is going to change, and adapting to those kinds of changes require money. The third thing we need to do is protect our polling places. Protect our polling places. What does that mean? That means making sure we have enough, making sure that they're well staffed, and making sure that they're safe and healthy. By enough, if we have polling places and serving enough voters, we can reduce the kind of congestion that happens on election day. We can smooth out the curve of people crushing our poll workers by arriving all at the same time. And we can be able to spread out who stands next to each other when they're waiting in polling places. By saying that they're well staffed, that means we have enough people who can troubleshoot, who can provide good customer service to voters, who can get people in and get people out, move people to curbside voting, help people fill out forms to figure out whether or not their absentee ballot came in or whether or not they should count a provisional ballot. We need enough poll workers, and we all need to be recruiting poll workers to make sure that our polling places are well staffed. And then finally, with respect to polling places, we need to make sure that they're safe and healthy, that they're sanitized often. I know we're going to talk a little bit later about some of the specifics, but those are all three really important things for polling places. With respect to vote by mail, people need to understand what the rules are for vote by mail. A lot of people in this country already vote by mail, but a whole bunch don't. People need to know, when are the deadlines? When is the last day you can apply for an absentee ballot or a mail ballot? When is the last day you can mail it in? Do you have technical requirements, like you need to use a particular envelope? Do you need to check a particular box? Do you need to sign it? Those are all things that voters need to be understanding and need to be educated about what to do. And then also for preparedness, we need to make sure that our fail-safes work. For those election nerds that are watching, we have something called provisional ballots, or sometimes like in New York, they're called affidavit ballots. These are ballots that are cast when somebody's eligibility is in question, or whether the criteria that allows them to vote is in question. Like maybe they don't have the right kind of photo ID. Maybe they're not on the rolls. Maybe your record suggests that they have moved and they haven't. Provisional ballots are an opportunity for election administrators to investigate, to look to see what is going on. Why wasn't that person on the rolls? Why do we think this person isn't eligible to vote? And they need to be used in a way that helps voters resolve problems that they have. Unfortunately, too often they're used as placebo ballots. They're used as giving somebody a paper ballot so that they'll fill it out and then they'll go away and they won't bother you. And that is not what these provisional ballots were designed to do. And they're not going to be helpful if they're not actually performing their intended function, which is to give election administrators the opportunity to investigate whether or not this ballot should be counted and when it should be, when the person is eligible to count it. So I'm really excited about the rest of the things that we can talk about. There's a lot of work to be done. I hope people are enthusiastic and not overwhelmed, because we are a resilient people. We have lots and lots in store for us, but there's a lot of talent and effort and energy behind this. And I think rather than panicking and getting scared, we need to harness that energy and use it as a force for making sure that we're going to be part of the solution and making sure that our election is as smooth as possible.
You know, I couldn't agree more. I think we need to take this seriously, but be paralyzed by it. It needs to be a motivator for action. And one of the things, and we'll talk about this more later, that we heard it from Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama yesterday, we hear it all the time, is to essentially make a voting plan and flatten the ballot curve, right? If you have vote by mail, apply now, right? Mail in your ballot early. Don't take a risk. Track your ballot. We'll talk about that too later. So I think this is really practical advice about being resilient and not letting the challenges dissuade you.
We're also finding out, and we know this, so like when people think that it's going to be such a mess that everything is going to go wrong, people are not going to bother, right? Like we know this to be true in a bunch of instances. So rather than despairing, we need to get to work because we can do this. We're just going to have to take it really seriously, and we have to get to work soon.
Yeah, well, and on that front, I want to bring in our next panelist who also works so closely with election officials on the ground and the nuts and bolts, Tiana Epps-Johnson, who is the founder and executive director of the Center for Tech and Civic Life. She is leading a team that is doing groundbreaking work to make U.S. elections more inclusive and more secure. Prior to founding and starting the Center for Tech and Civic Life, Tiana was the New Organizing Institute's Election Administration Director from 2012 to 2015, and she previously worked on the Voting Rights Project for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. So we're all family here, I guess. Tiana is the recipient of the 2020 Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship, was the inaugural cohort of Obama Foundation Fellows, and was a Harvard Ash Center Technology and Democracy Fellow. There are fellowships that nobody even tells me about because I think they don't think I'd be a good applicant. So I like to meet people like you and learn about these things. Tiana, your organization says, and I'm sorry to read from your website, we're on a mission to modernize the American voting experience. I'm going to go out on a limb and guess we still have a long way to go with getting there. But as I understand it, your work focuses on helping provide training and tools to local election officials who actually run the nuts and bolts of our elections. We have federal elections, but they are run at the state and local level. So why don't we start there? What are you seeing on the ground? What are the biggest challenges, and what can we do to address them?
Thanks so much. I'm really delighted to be invited into this conversation. And yes, at the center, we are working with election departments across the country, supporting them in running excellent, inclusive, secure elections. And coming into the 2020 election, we knew that there was going to be a huge demand on the system. Folks were super enthusiastic and continue to be super enthusiastic about voting. And that meant that election departments needed to prepare to serve a huge influx of voters. As we came into 2020 at the Center for Tech and Civic Life, we had some really, really clear priorities about the ways that we could support election departments in this work. We were focused on supporting election departments effectively communicate with the public and really establish themselves as that ground truth of trusted information, given deep concerns that we had about mis, mal, and disinformation. So both the intentional spreading of incorrect information about how the voting process works, as well as unintentional spreading of misinformation, given that our system just happens to be very complex. We were also really laser focused coming out of January in our staff retreat on making sure that we were supporting election departments, really raise the bar on their election security practices, from cybersecurity practices to adding more efficient and robust practices to verify election results to, again, effectively communicating with the public about the measures election departments are taking every day to protect our election system. And then March rolled around. And it was really clear that the pandemic was going to have a massive and immediate impact and implications for voting. And while we didn't lose sight of the priorities around supporting election departments with communication and security, we've continued to provide election officials with tools and training on both of those things. We also recognize that while there's no election official that I know prior to 2020 that had administered an election in a global pandemic, there were best practices that we could look at in this otherwise uncertain moment and connect those officials with. And so that's what we've been doing at the Center for Tech and Civic Life. We began a 2-month sprint of back-to-back every Tuesday and Thursday webinars for election departments, lifting up best practices across a range of issues that they could apply immediately to the way that they were administering elections to serve voters in a way that allowed folks to vote in a way that provided access but also was safe. And, you know, even though this is a sort of new environment to administer elections in, there are a lot that we already know and know how to do well. So, what we were lifting up for election departments are public health practices, the same things that are applicable to every other aspect of our public life in a pandemic mirrors how we should be thinking about voting. We need to reduce crowds and in-person gathering. So, one of the big reasons that it's important for folks, if they would like to vote by mail, to choose to vote by mail is to reduce the number of people that need to be in person on election day. And then if we do choose to vote in person, just like if we choose to do anything else in person, we need to wear masks and socially distance and wash our hands and sanitize the area and use personal protective equipment. And so we've really focused on helping election departments understand really how to operationalize that in a polling place to ensure that voters are safe. We also know that election departments across the country are serving more voters by mail than they ever have before. But states like Oregon and Washington and Colorado are really old hat at serving the majority of their voters by mail. And every state has already had, coming into this election, some sort of mail voting. So rather than have election departments reinvent the wheel and sort of burn precious time, we really focused on making sure that our election departments knew the best practices that already existed and how to implement them right now in this context. So now as we transition down the home stretch, the next 75 or so days, what I'm seeing on the ground are election officials absolutely moving mountains to deliver a safe process for voters. I really want to underscore what Myrna lifted up. Election departments need funding. Experts like folks at the Brennan Center estimate that it'll take about $4 billion to run a safe process that works for voters this year. So far, $400 million has been allocated. 400 million is far less than 4 billion. The number one thing that we're hearing from election departments is that they need funding. The second thing is that essentially election departments are running 2 elections at the same time. The highest volume mail election that they've ever run, and a high turnout in-person election where they need to maintain their same in-person voting footprint. And that's a huge task. And then the other thing that I'm seeing, and sometimes I think we forget, is that election departments are made up of humans who also have to deal with the impact of the pandemic in their own family and offices. We've seen election departments that have had to close or who have lost staff or who are really struggling to find poll workers because of the ways that the pandemic has directly impacted the communities that they serve. So for us at the center, we're laser focused on supporting election departments over the next 75 days with tools, with technical assistance, and we're cheering them on and showing our deep gratitude for their public service while supporting them to be really great stewards of our democracy.
Well, Tiana, that's inspiring, and I'm both awed by the challenge and then also awed by the sort of intentionality of the solutions. And I'm not an expert at math, but I do know that 400 million is quite a bit less than the billion that we need, and there's work to be done. So one of the things that has struck me, and I want to bring in our next panelist, is the level of innovation that is required here. Finding new partnerships, finding ways to overcome the challenges. And Kevin Clayton, our next panelist, is somebody who's done that. Kevin is the Vice President of Diversity, Inclusion, and Engagement for the Cleveland Cavaliers operating company. He's responsible for developing and leading diversity and inclusion strategic planning for all the Cavaliers properties. That includes the Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse, which we'll talk about with Kevin in a minute. He is only one of 3 C-suite level executives out of all 147 major professional sports teams to hold this position. And I know later today, Kevin, you're going to be on another panel you put together with a bunch of sports executives around diversity and sports. Kevin previously held leadership roles with the Bon Secours Mercy Health, American Cancer Society, U.S. Tennis Association, Russell Corporation, and among many philanthropic roles here in Cleveland and elsewhere. Kevin is also the new board chair for Community Health Charities, a national health organization that for more than 65 years has been creating stronger, healthier communities, working with a huge number of nonprofit organizations. So, Kevin, a little more than a year ago into your role with the Cavs, you were back in your hometown. You have seen the twin pandemics, the pandemic of COVID-19 and of systemic racial injustice, and seized the moment. I've had the opportunity to talk to you with Cavaliers coach J.B. Bickerstaff, with general manager Kobe Altman, about law enforcement, education, voting, and there's so much passion. And last week, this is where it becomes not just talk, it's action. The Cavs announced that their arena, Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse, will be a polling place for the November 3rd election, as well as hosting activities around September 22nd's National Voter Registration Day. And I know as Tiana talked about and Myrna talked about, you have been working closely with local election officials on this effort, and there's really a sort of a spirit of innovation. So, Kevin, sports teams across the country, but particularly I think NBA teams, have stepped outside of their usual lanes, and they've taken action to help their communities vote. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the Cavs are doing, what you're doing, what led you to take these steps, and what lessons we can take away?
Yeah. So thank you, Jeremy. And I'm actually honored to be here with Kristen and, Myrna and Tiana. And really, if I think about my role in kind of the sports world I represent, I'm probably an unlikely candidate to be participating in this conversation. However, as you mentioned, innovation and the importance of innovation. And let me go back to when George Floyd was murdered. And our organization took a very proactive approach to say, what can we do? What can we do to make an impact from a community standpoint? And if you think about the perfect storm with COVID-19 keeping us out since early March, now we had the George Floyd murder. We had a number of our team members that were trying to figure out what can we do to make a difference? How can we add value? And one of the ideas that came up was, let's put together a voting task force. And it wasn't to align ourselves with either party. It was, how can we inspire people to influence policy by encouraging people to get out to vote? So as we put together this task force, one of the first things that we identified was, we have a building that had been sitting vacant since early March. And our building, which is relatively brand new from a renovation standpoint, we have, tens of thousands of square footage in an atrium area that it made sense for us to potentially host the voting on November 3rd. So we actually spent some time educating ourselves on what the process would be to turn our building into a polling location for November 3rd. And we learned so many other things, just like my colleagues before me just talked about, all of the challenges and some of the barriers for communities to vote. And as we spent time with our county administrator, the CEO of the county, our director of elections in Cuyahoga County, here are a couple things that came up. One was the fact of, from a polling standpoint, and one of my colleagues mentioned this, that we need pollsters. We need the actual labor that we need in Cuyahoga County. It's like 1,800 people that they needed. Secondly, if you think about what happened, particularly in Ohio, early on during the primary in the spring elections, there was so many people that were lined up down the street with social distancing, trying to get in the polling areas. People turned around and left. So we're like, look, we have this beautiful building. We can accommodate that because from a space standpoint, people can social distance inside our building. And then thirdly, around how can we make an impact from a sports team perspective. So our task force came back and said, look, this is something that we absolutely can make an impact on. And here's what we decided to do. We realized that sports, and one of the analogies that I like to use is that sports is a Trojan horse. With sports, people actually gravitate toward professional sports teams. And with that, we have to be more than just the athletic part of the conversation. We want to be part of the civic engagement, part of the policy change. And we gathered several other organizations, nonprofits together from a voting perspective. And then we went to the other two professional sports teams in Cleveland. We went to the Browns and the Indians. We talked about how we can come together to leverage our three brands to help drive voting in Cleveland. So we are actually going to announce very shortly a collaborative relationship with the Browns and Indians, where increased voting is one of the three pillars, but we're also going to focus on law enforcement engagement. And then the third thing is education, and how do we kind of have some impact on education reform where all people can be educated fairly, starting from the early school system on up. So on the voting piece, though, we now have on National Registration Day, we're opening up our building, and it's going to be a festive environment with encouraging people to register to vote. We also, with the Indians and Browns, they're doing the same thing. One of the things that came up on the earlier comments was trying to get people to early vote. And with the 30 days prior to November 3rd, what the county election board told us was that there's this log jam of people that try to come in to early vote in the last 10 days. So you got 20 days ahead of time. And how can we motivate people to do that? So we have a number of assets and things in which we can use, from our mascots to giveaways and things of that nature. And with the 3 sports teams, knowing that it's going to be a central location at the County Board of Elections, we're going to alternate weeks where we do things to encourage people to come out. Unfortunately, because of COVID and where the seasons are, our players aren't going to be able to participate. But imagine coming out and being able to participate with the Cavs organization one week, the Browns one week, the Indians the next week. So we're focused on how can we encourage people to come out and vote using our brand and our assets. Secondly, from a voter education standpoint, how can we help to educate voters? And here's the last piece that really encourages me about our organization and how we're trying to walk the talk. And that is that we are giving our employees actually paid time to volunteer for some of these events, as well as on November 3rd to actually go out and vote. So we're putting kind of our resources where our thoughts are so that we can impact the community in a much bigger way than just playing basketball or with our hockey team playing hockey. And it's a 3-team strategy on how to leverage our 3 brands. And then we have players and coaches that will be doing PSAs that will be talking about voter education, registration, early voting, and voting.
I got to say, I love that we have just broken some news here on the Raven Respite. And Kevin, it is so exciting that you are walking the talk. And I also know from our conversation that this isn't just a one-time or short-term thing, that you are making a long-term commitment, looking ahead to a post-pandemic world where we still have these massive inequities. We still need to reach audiences and into our neighborhoods here in Cleveland and elsewhere. And so your long-term commitment is also exciting, what you're trying to do.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, we absolutely are committed to doing that. And if I could just share one strategy that we're doing, and we're working with the Urban League in Greater Cleveland. And if you think about voter registration and how if you get young men and women to vote or to register to vote once they turn 18, we're going to begin to do these birthday parties. So, if you turn 18 in November, coming down to the field house or going over the Brown Stadium or Indian Stadium, we're going to have a birthday party once a month for people who turn 18 to try to encourage them to register. What they have to do, though, is to get for admittance is to register to vote on the spot.
So it's great, and I know that other sports teams have also been doing this. The Hawks using the arena, I think maybe in Milwaukee, I know in DC and the Dodgers, and so this is becoming a great and welcome trend, and sort of hopefully we'll have long-term benefits. So for the benefit of the audience, we only have until 3. We're getting comments. You can put comments or questions if you're watching into the chat box and we're seeing them. I'm going to do some questions with the group here, and then we'll leave some time for Q&A. But as questions pop in the comment box, we will also come in and try to bring some of those issues in as we discuss it as well. So I want to start, Kristen Clarke, with a question for you, but then anybody should jump in. Every time we talk about ways of making voting more accessible, whether it's vote by mail during a pandemic or we talk about voter ID, we hear about voter fraud, right? The President of the United States has been talking about we can't have universal mail-in ballot because of voter fraud, that somehow absentee ballot voting is fine in Florida, where he votes by mail, and this has been a long change. So this fight is not new to you, not new to me. Can you just walk us through, is voter fraud a real problem? Isn't framing the question this way actually a problem? Yeah,
it's a pretext to justify all of these vote suppression schemes that we have been seeing throughout the years. The Brennan Center and our Myrna and friends have long touted this very powerful stat that you've got a greater chance of being struck by lightning than seeing vote fraud. It's just absolutely ridiculous, the notion that you would have people marching into polling sites impersonating the dead. So it's a pretext, and it's tired, frankly. And whenever you hear that, know that the real objective of what is being pushed and peddled is something that is harmful to Americans, something that will make it harder for ordinary Americans to cast their vote, and that will have a starker impact among the most vulnerable among us, poor people, communities of color, homeless people, students, and so forth. It's a term that when you hear it, it should set off an alarm. We're hearing this now with vote by mail, and it's remarkable because in 2016, over 16 states voted by mail without issue. More than half of voters in those states voted by mail. And the numbers are actually remarkable. In Colorado, 94% of all voters voted by mail. In Washington State, almost 98%. In Florida, 68%, Georgia, 58%, Arkansas, 59%. And I can go on. I mean, in states all across the country, they have been doing robust vote by mail successfully for years. It helps to ease the burdens that election officials face on election day itself. And most important, we need this voting method in the middle of a pandemic. Now is the time for people to work to find out what are the vote by mail rules in their state. And now's the time to start taking action to make sure that they can put their requests for absentee ballots in the pipeline.
Kristen, I like to think that you just have those stats up on your screen at all times in case somebody asks you about it.
I'm ready.
You're just ready. Myrna, I know you at the Brennan Center.
Kristen she's right. This vote by mail, this fraud stuff is not only like tired and a lie, it's also highly racialized, and it's becoming increasingly more so under this administration. Everybody remembers that when the president first got elected, he kept saying that he would have won the popular vote if it had not been for, and he used a highly offensive word for people that are in this country that are non-citizens. When we see investigations that are happening in North Carolina because people think that there are people on the rolls, it's highly racialized language. When people are going after drop boxes, like when the campaigns are going after drop boxes, it's in urban areas that are diverse. So I think not only is this a way of actually suppressing the votes of people of color and limiting who can have a say in our government and who can't, it's also contributing to this like toxic hostility toward people who have been traditionally marginalized and sending a very clear message that this democracy is not for them. And I think not only do we need to push back on this disinformation because it's tragic and undermines the very faith in our electoral processes, but it also contributes to white supremacy and hate and just making Americans not feel like they are welcome in our democracy. And it's something we need to push back on every time we hear it.
Yeah. And, while we're myth busting, I would like to also, address one of the things that we've heard a lot, as well as that vote by mail might benefit one political party over the other. There have been studies about the impact of vote by mail, and vote by mail does increase overall turnout, but it does not impact the vote share of a given party, which means that vote by mail does benefit voters, but it doesn't have a partisan outcome. It doesn't benefit a particular political party. It is just another option that gives voters an option for how they most prefer to return a ballot. And I also wanted to just reiterate one of the things that we heard about the importance of, for example, choosing to vote early in the early voting available time, and not just waiting till the very last minute. I am someone, I will admit, I procrastinate about a lot of things. I am a human. It is in our nature to wait until the last minute. And I would just really urge folks in this moment to fight that nature and to work to not procrastinate when it comes to voting, because there is a lot at stake. And so what that can look like are a few different things. One of the things that you might hear in the news is this idea of flattening the absentee ballot curve. What does that mean? Election departments, when you request to vote by mail, have to then take your application, process it, enter your information, check your information, and then get that vote by mail ballot out to you. If you can request your vote by mail ballot now, or as soon as you're able to in your state, then that means election departments can process that request and get your ballot out to you as soon as possible, and not let them get crushed by a bunch of requests for people to vote by mail at the last minute when election departments are also trying to run the process of actually voting. So the sooner that we can request our mail ballots, the better. And similarly, when it comes to early voting starting, the sooner that folks can get out and vote early if they're doing it in person, or return their mail ballot in the mail or to a drop box, the more likely that you will have the opportunity to avoid any issues with your vote being cast or counted as you intend, or if there are any issues, that you'll have an opportunity to resolve it or go through a cure process, which it's called in many places, where you have the opportunity, if there's something that doesn't quite match up to all the information that the election department needs, something that's not quite right, that you'll have an opportunity to then fix that so that your vote can still be counted. So again, I know I do it myself all of the time, wait until the last minute for things. And this is a time where, planning really matters. Make your vote plan, request your ballot as early as you're able to, and return it as soon as you're able to.
So Kevin Clayton, I know you wanted to add into this conversation as well.
Yeah, I sure did. And I just want to offer just a point of historical perspective. And that is that for the African-American community, the right to vote is like a celebration. It's a right of honor. And I think if there's a certain party that's trying to maybe demotivate that group of people from voting or going to the polls, or to maybe scare them from a early voting by mail, the reality is that going to the poll is a way to celebrate those that have died before us. So it's not what you see from a percentage wise is that people of color typically aren't the ones that are actually mailing in their ballots, because there's lots of different factors, from just not trusting that the ballot will ever get there and to be able to celebrate their right to vote. So the coming out and actually voting day of, or early voting, you'll see a higher percentage of people of color, particularly the African-American community, that is going to come out because of what our forefathers and foremothers went through before to give us that right to vote, which there's something different in actually casting that ballot, walking out of that booth, versus putting it in the mailbox. So I'm not real sure if that strategy is going to be effective of affecting the mail-in ballots as it relates to particular demographics of our community.
Kevin, thank you so much for that. And one thing I think we should bring into this conversation is, and we're going to get to the post office, and I don't want to let that go. It's the sort of the elephant in the room. But I want to talk about drop boxes, because that keeps coming up. And I know Myrna had something to add about drop boxes as well. And what you're saying, Kevin, about the critical importance of voting, seeing your ballot handed into the Board of Elections, not just putting it in the mail. Drop boxes, which are sort of dedicated drop spaces that don't go through the post office, but are sort of staffed by the boards of elections, are one way to go and see your ballot go. Here in Cuyahoga County, starting during the early vote window, there's a ballot, an actual secure box at the Board of Elections where you can go and drop your ballots up in 24/7 and watch 24/7. We're fighting for additional drop boxes here in Ohio. People are advocating with our Secretary of State, especially with what we've seen in the mail. I don't know, Myrna, you wanted to talk about drop boxes, and you too, Tiana. So I don't know, feel free to jump on in and talk about this, and then we'll get to post offices before we log off today, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, what I was going to say is that the interesting thing about drop boxes is that it is yet another option for voters. And when we are in the middle of a once in a generation pandemic, people need options because our lives are complicated, and different people are going to have different risk factors and different ways to respond to those, to the complications of their life. If people are worried about going into the polling places for health reasons, they may want to use vote by mail. If they're worried about the post office not functioning the way that it should be, they may want to go in person. Drop boxes are a third option where They don't have to go into a polling place, but they can go somewhere close where they know that there is a dedicated person that is going to go pick it up and take it to the election office. So when you have, like you do in Pennsylvania, where the political campaign to reelect the president is actively going after the Secretary of State and the counties that are providing drop boxes, it is just a not even veiled attempt at voter suppression and closing down options. And again, if we want this election to work, voters need more options. So constricting how people can vote is not going to make our democracy more robust. It's not going to make it more participatory. It's not going to include any voices. It's wrong-headed and it's suppressive.
So I know Charlie had popped a question from our audience here, and I'll read it. If we can bring the Chiron back, that's great. Amy Franti asks, I plan on bringing my filled out ballot to an official ballot drop box in my city. Are there enough drop boxes across the U.S.? Are they protected from tampering? How often are the ballots collected? Myrna, I'm sure you have a thought on this.
They're not. It's going to depend upon county to county. Not every state provides drop boxes. The ones that do tend to have security measures so that people can feel comfortable about it. The security measures are varied. This is one of those we need to get to work kind of issues where if you don't have enough drop boxes in your county, press to get them. If your state doesn't provide them, try to get legislation passed at some point so that we can do them. We need to have a lot of options for voters so that we can be resilient against whatever challenges we're facing. But the short answer of is there enough? Probably not. Can we make it better and improve that? Definitely yes. But how you do that is going to depend upon what state and county.
The question, they're 100% secure, right? These are staffed directly by, I mean, this is a proven.
The ones that use it have smart and tried and trusted security measures to do it. This is not rocket science. This is something that we can do. Plenty of states do it well. Not enough do it, but it is something that we should be pushing for and putting in the toolkit that are available to voters to make sure that we're able to have a smooth election.
Yeah, and Tiana Epps-Johnson, we were chatting about this before about ways to sort of make drop boxes more fun and really sort of lean into the idea of drop boxes as a celebration of voting.
Yeah, I want to talk about the ways that I just loved that Charlie brought up the point that voting is joyful. Civic engagement is joyful. For me, one of the things I love about voting is being able to, go to a polling place and see my neighbors and interact with them there. And, but this year I'm going to be voting differently. And one of the really cool things I've seen out of Baltimore when they had a primary this year was an initiative done by Baltimore Votes and Black Girls Vote there. And they did this cool party at the mailbox campaign where they made these really cool gift packages that they sent out to thousands of Baltimore voters that had like signage and party supplies and other things, and encouraged people to, celebrate online, posting about going to drop off their ballot at a drop box. And really turned it into this incredible celebratory experience, even though people couldn't have that same in-person voting experience. So I do hope that we continue to celebrate how amazing it is to be able to have the opportunity to go and vote and to participate in this type of process. I think the other thing that I would lift up to the points that Myrna was making before about the importance of having drop boxes as one of the ways that people can return ballots. Looking at other states that have had a history of mail voting, we know that when people are returning ballots, the number one way that they do it, even if they've received the ballot in the mail, is in person. The second is to a drop box. And then the third method is actually in the mail, like in a blue box or through the USPS. And so in places where, vote by mail has been going on for a long time, drop boxes have always been really a critical part of the infrastructure and the preferred way that voters have chosen to return their ballot. Again, likely because people do want to have that experience of essentially taking their ballot and putting it in what is, essentially the ballot box.
So I want to come back. I want to come back into the topic that we sort of headed off the conversation with, and it's top of people's mind because we're all watching the political firestorm over the post office. And The post office had 90% approval ratings, and their nightmare stories of people needing life-saving medicines that are delayed, Social Security checks that are delayed, since the new Postmaster General, a major funder of President Trump, came in June, and they're taking boxes offline. It was reported the U.S. Postal Service General Thomas Marshall sent a letter to election officials in 46 days, warning them that even ballots properly returned according to election laws might not be delivered in time to be counted. Yet, and this is where I really want and Kristen Clarke, I want to bring you in here. Encouraging people to vote by mail and vote at home is a big part of mobilizing in this pandemic to make sure that we are expanding the ability to vote. It's a safe way to vote without impacting anybody, election workers, friends, family, that people die with. You can actually vote with your screen on to really, I mean, it's a great thing to celebrate voting at home. Glad to see the media shine a light, glad to see the oversight. But is there a risk? What can we do to make sure that we're not discouraging people and that we're able to sort of fight for and use this tool?
Yeah, well, it's important to make a plan to vote now, to figure out how are you going to vote in your state? What are the available options? How early can you go ahead and request your absentee ballot? Are they going to be automatically sending the absentee ballot to you? What are the early voting options in your state? Are you somebody who wants to wait and vote in person on election day? Now it's the time to make a plan and to make sure that everyone around you, your friends, your family members, are similarly activating a plan to vote in 2020. That said, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, this looming crisis that we face with the Postal Service. Just as you know, Louis DeJoy is somebody who was a Trump mega donor. He knows nothing about the Postal Service operations. He started 2 months ago and has wreaked havoc, chaos, and confusion. You could literally go out and talk to your local Postal Service worker who will say, yeah, things are different, and things have slowed down. You can talk to somebody running a small business out of their home who'll tell you that for the first time in years, first-class mail that used to get to its destination in 2-3 days is now taking well over a week. So it's important that we keep our eye on this issue. But here's what I'd say. One, we shouldn't panic. The most important thing is to vote early and try not to wait until the last minute this election season. Two, we should be raising our voices and holding this administration accountable when they take action that harms our civil rights, when they take action that threatens our right to vote. And the Postal Service is precisely that right now. This Saturday, there actually are mass actions being planned across the country. You can go to savethepostoffice.net for more information on this effort being led by our friends at moveon.org. 11 a.m. local time in your community is when people will be gathering to speak out about the need to hold the United States Postal Service accountable. Now, Louis DeJoy, in response to all of the backlash and fire that he's felt over the last several days, put out a thin statement yesterday saying, don't worry, I'm going to suspend these actions. His words ring hollow. They mean nothing. The damage has been done. And so we filed a federal lawsuit on Tuesday suing Louis DeJoy and suing the United States Postal Service because we need more than his words, his mea culpa. We need him to take remedial action to address the damage that he has caused. We need him to put the blue mailboxes back in communities, return the scanning equipment that mass sorts the mail, restore overtime, lift the hiring freeze, and reverse course on all of the changes that he did, and get the U.S. Postal Service back to status quo and back to a place where it's up and running and able to handle all of the needs that we face in the midst of this pandemic and handle the ballots that will be cast by millions of Americans who are voting this election season. So the one thing that I want to say is that there have been some very well-intentioned efforts that have popped up over the last several days. Some people who've said, you know what, we'll create drop boxes on our own, or we'll start organizing collection efforts. And because the laws vary all over the country, it's important that people be very careful before they race forward with these efforts and make sure they're not doing anything that runs afoul of the law. There's some states that actually impose limits on how many ballots you can return, impose limits on who can return your ballot if you hand it over to somebody else. It's not the case that you can just use FedEx in some states. They have to be a state that actually certifies that third-party vendor. And I think there was a great question that said something about giving the ballot over to corporations to drop off. And I don't know about that. There's certain businesses that are set up to do their businesses and are not set up to be in the business of returning ballots. I think we got to be careful before we hand off responsibility to third parties. But sounding an alarm, speaking up is something that's really critical. But at the same time, we need not panic. We actually just have to activate early and early vote right now. And the last thing that I'll say is, if people have questions about any of this, how do I get registered? Can I trust dropping my ballot in the mail? They can call our nonpartisan election protection program. This is a program that's been in place for 20 years. We're about doing one thing, getting accurate information to voters, and that number is 866-OUR-VOTE, 866-OUR-VOTE. We're going to be here 365 days a year to make sure that every voter can have their voice heard.
The Louis DeJoy, thank you for that. The Louis DeJoy response is sort of like catching a bank robber, and he'll say, well, I'm not going to steal any more money now that you caught me, but I'm not giving back what I already stole. It's so totally inadequate. And I think the more we can have mass action, the more we can have advocacy, but then the more we can take practical steps also to understand, let's vote early. So let's talk about one more practical step, because I think we're running up against time. And one of the things that people are always, they hear the call to alarm. Like, how can I help? How can I help other people do this? So one of the big needs across the country are for healthy, younger poll workers, people to step up in their community to be poll workers. If you've ever gone to vote at a poll, there's often older people that staff those polling places in your neighborhoods on election days. And those are people that during a pandemic should not be exposed like that. So Myrna, if you could talk to us a little about what is the national need, how do we do it? And then after that, I know Kevin Clayton wants to talk about this too, because it's a big piece of what the Cavs are doing for election day as well.
Okay, we need people to be poll workers. We need people to contact their election administrators and volunteer to do it. The Brennan Center and the Lawyers Committee have put together these guides that will let you know where to start. If you don't know how to do it, they're available on both of our websites. But another thing that's really important is that we need to make sure that these polling places are actually safe. We partnered with the Infectious Disease Society of America, which is a trade association of infectious disease specialists, MDs, PhDs, folks who are in the business of saving lives against infectious diseases. And they are convinced, we are convinced that if done correctly, poll sites can be safe for people to go to. What do we need to do? One, we need to be sensible about where we site them. We need to not be putting them in nursing home or senior facilities, but putting them in places where folks can get to without having to get on public transportation. We need to be making sure that they're sanitized and that they're designed in ways, little things we can do about making sure that the machines get clean, making sure that the pens are disposable. All of those things can help. And we need safe poll workers, right? Our poll workers cannot be disease vectors. They're the ones that are going to be there all day interacting with the same voters. So we need to make sure that they have the PPE to keep themselves safe and from spreading anything. We need to make sure that they are healthy when they walk in the door. This is not a problem that will be easy to fix without work, but it is a solvable problem. This is another example where we just need to block and tackle, get down to work, figure out what the steps are and make sure that we get them done, because this is a solvable problem. How we do safe in-person polling place is something that we are all capable of contributing to.
Well, blocking and tackling is the wrong sport, but it's the right to go to a sports metaphor. Let's hear from Kevin Clayton about what the Cavs are doing to help with this effort.
Yeah, so thank you, Jeremy. Yesterday, I was actually in a conversation with the CEO of the Urban League here in Cleveland. And the proposal that she had given me was to do a job fair at our building for poll workers. And again, it's just kind of the sexiness of, oh, we're coming down to the arena. We have plenty of space, but it also allows her constituents to now be part of the process. So as I said, I just got the proposal yesterday around doing a job fair, which will increase employment for a one day, but to work 16, 18 hours or 14 to 16 hours for a couple $100, that means a lot to people. Secondly, as I mentioned, we are giving our team members, our employees, a paid time off during that course of the day and encouraging them to become poll workers, not just in our building, but across multiple counties in Northeast Ohio. Thirdly, we are actually encouraging other companies to do the same. And one of the things that we know about from a poll worker standpoint is that the day of, back in the springtime, there was a high number of absenteeism where people called in because they just didn't feel safe coming in. So it's not only just those individuals that are aligned and assigned to work the polls, but it's having the backup as well. And that's where the youth and the younger demographics of our community can come into play and contribute as well.
So Kevin, while I've got you on screen, unfortunately we're at 3 o'clock. I mean, we could talk about this all day. There's so many things to cover, but do you have a last thought for us before we'll go around? And I'd love to hear from each of you about sort of a parting message for us as we head into the last 75 days for its election. And I will note that Election Day actually starts here in Ohio. You can vote early starting October 6th. You can request your absentee ballot now. So Election Day is really underway. But what should we know and think about, Kevin?
Right. So two things for me, one of which is that obviously voting affects everything that we do. Every system that we've identified that actually drives systemic racism can be addressed and remedied through who actually controls policy. So voting, yes, absolutely important. But secondly, non-traditional partners can help in driving everything that my colleagues have said, from voter education, voter registration, to poll workers, because you have organizations like us who people would not think that we play a large role, but we absolutely are taking a front and center role in Cleveland, Ohio, to help to encourage voting. So look for non-traditional partners in non-traditional places.
Well, Kevin, thank you for your leadership. You're shining a light here. I look forward to continue working with you here. And we will continue to look for the Cavs, and then you broke news in the Browns and Indians too to join into the effort. So we're so excited.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you. Tiana Epps-Johnson, I'd love to hear from you about a last parting thought as we're heading into this critical last phase of the election.
Yeah, at this time of great uncertainty, I would just encourage folks to give yourself the gift of some planning, make yourself a vote plan, and know something for sure. And if you need some information about not only the laws and rules where you live, but also how to most safely engage in the voting process, please visit healthyvoting.org. It's a site that will have 50 state election law, as well as it was developed in partnership with the American Public Health Association. So public health experts have given guidance on how to ensure that you are engaging in a way that is most healthy for you.
That's great advice, and thank you. And thank you for what you're doing on the ground. Good luck in the weeks ahead. Myrna Perez, if you wouldn't mind coming back on and then giving a last word, and what should we be thinking about now?
Our country's in the middle of a reckoning for things that we have done and things that we have left undone, and the way that our institutions of power have not appropriately reflected and responded to all of us. When we are in a crisis like that, we're not going to get out of it unless we are able to leverage the experience and expertise of all of us. And it is not just a matter of some people having their vote suppressed or some people not. This is a situation in which all of us are going to be worse off if we do not benefit from the experience and expertise of all of us. And so we all need to do our part in making sure that every eligible American is able to vote. We've got a big job ahead of us, but as Kevin said, we can all do something. There is something that you can do, whether it's be signing up to be a poll worker, making sure that your neighbors understand when the deadlines are, offering to drive somebody to the post office to get some stamps, helping somebody get to the polls. Don't feel like you are helpless in all of this, because there is so much work that needs to get done. You have a lot of really talented, committed advocates working on it, but we actually need all of us, and there is something useful for you can do. So I hope you will join us.
We are not helpless. It is not hopeless. And with people like you on the front line, I feel confident that we're gonna give people the tools they need and get this done. Kristen Clarke, I don't know if I'd love to hear from you if you're still here for a last thought. I know we've gone past the time, so if not, I can close us out. So I just have one last thought. If I could end on a brief story. Oh, Kristen, yeah, love to hear from you. Coming on now. Maybe some technical things. So we're all used to this. I've taken some comfort watching the DNC, knowing that they have the same technical problems we have. Let's see if we can get Kristen back on screen. And if we do, Kristen, feel free to interrupt me. Absolutely. So I'm just going to do a brief story, and then if Kristen comes back, she can have the last word. I was on a panel about voting last week here in Cleveland, and during the Q&A, an older woman jumped in to ask a question about homeless people, including the newly homeless as a result of the pandemic. How would they be able to register? How can they vote? What can they do? And, we talked some, we gave answers about the Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless, the organizations that work to make sure people are able to vote. And then she said, look, I came to this country after surviving the Holocaust, and she drew on her experience as a Holocaust survivor and connected with the plight of the homeless and disenfranchised populations now and what she could do. And it was just so inspiring to me that is what she wanted. She wanted to take care of the people that were most vulnerable here. And so I take heart from that lesson, and nobody better to hand it to in terms of inspiring us than Kristen Clarke.
Well, this was a great hour. Thanks so much, Jeremy, for bringing us together. But I feel like every conversation we've got to close by lifting up the great John Lewis, who dedicated his life to this work, to this fight, to shedding blood to make sure that we all can exercise voice in our democracy. And I think about the protests that are happening across the country right now, people who are standing up and marching and demanding racial justice, demanding an end to police violence, demanding a world that is more just and equitable. And one of the most powerful places where we can wield voice and have power is at the ballot box. So my hope is that at this moment, which is truly an inflection point for everyone in our democracy, that we'll see people continuing to march in the streets, but march to the polls November 3rd or well before then, and fight and use the ballot as a way to hold people accountable and as a way to demand and champion for reforms that can make our democracy a more strong and equitable place, and the kind of world that John Lewis fought for every step and at every stage of his life.
Well, that is the best possible way to end a panel on voting is talking about the late great John Lewis and the fight he led and that he symbolized almost more than anybody else. And we have to carry his work through. So thank you, Kristen Clarke. Thank you, Myrna Perez. Thank you, Tiana Epps-Johnson. Thank you, Kevin Clayton, not just for coming onto this panel today and enlightening us, for your leadership, for what you're doing and not just saying to protect the right to vote. So please visit our website to take some respite of your own and enjoy a one-of-a-kind virtual art exhibit from DC-based artist Row called New Leaders. It's a digital exhibit you can walk through from the comfort and safety of your own home. Viewers can check out Row's work at ravenrespite.com/art exhibit. And check out all the other great Raven Respite programming we're doing. And please, as you heard today, make a plan, flatten the ballot curve, help your friends and neighbors make a voting plan, help them figure out how to vote. And we can do this together. We can lift up our community. Thank you all, and good luck over the next few months. We'll hopefully talk again soon.